let's get right to it. Right now, what we're going to do is just do a mad review of Chapter 10, Properties and Disorders of the Skin. First, let's get our attention to page 220. And at the top of the page, what we should have highlighted is what dermatology is, which is the scientific study of the skin, its nature, structure, functions, diseases, and treatment. Now, after we've gone over that, we have to get into the histology of skin. What that consists of is knowing that the skin is the largest and one of the most important organs of the body, as it states in the text. But more so, what we need to highlight for the sake of the exam would be that healthy skin is slightly moist, soft, and flexible with a smooth, fine-grained texture. Okay, and we also want to make certain that we highlight that the slightly acidic pH of healthy skin provides a protective response or considered a protective barrier against organisms that try to touch or enter it, meaning the skin. Now, the next thing that you want to jump down to is in the next paragraph, second sentence. Skin varies in its thickness. Now, it is thinnest on the eyelids and thickest on the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. This fact we must highlight and look for it on the exam. Lastly, we need to make certain that we know that the skin is constructed of two clearly defined divisions, the epidermis and the dermis. Now, what we need to know about the epidermis is that it's the outermost layer of the skin. It can also be called the cuticle or the scarf skin. Now, if we're talking about layers of the skin, within the epidermis, we also have sublayers. Let's begin. The first bullet point we see is the stratum corneum. Now, in the stratum corneum, it consists of tightly packed scale-like cells that are continually shed and replaced by cells coming to the surface from underlying layers. Now, we know those underlying layers have to do with the papillary layer and also the stratum germinativum, but we'll get to that later. The other bullet point that we're going to highlight is the stratum granulosum. Now, this is considered the granular layer because it consists of cells that look like distinct granules, and you'll be able to see that on figure 10.1 in reference to the layer of the skin, layers of the skin. Now, let's look at page 221. We want to highlight the stratum spinosum. Now, here's one thing about the stratum spinosum. I know that in our figure 10.1, it is not shown in the sublayers of the epidermis between the granulosum and the germinativum. However, it is a sublayer that lies above the basal strata, also known as the stratum germinativum, and beneath the stratum granulosum. Now, you will find this fact in the first paragraph or the first bullet point on page 221. And the stratum spinosum is referred to as the spiny layer. Okay, now let's jump down into the dermis. Now, in the dermis, we find the papillary layer and the reticular layer. But as far as the dermis, one of the facts that we have to know is that it is also called the derma, corium, cutis, or true skin. Now, the dermis is about 25 times thicker than the epidermis and consists of a highly sensitive vascular layer of connective tissues. Okay. Now, these connective tissues, we of course would have to correlate with our nerves, and we will get to those in a sec. Flip to page 222. Let's talk about the papillary layer. Now, in the papillary layer, it contains small structures called tactile corpuscles with nerve fiber endings that are sensitive to touch and pressure. This is what gives us our sense of touch and things of that nature, and we're going to get off into that on page 223 in a second. But let's jump down into the reticular layer. Now, this is the deeper layer of the dermis, which supplies the skin with oxygen and nutrients. And one of the biggest components that go off into the reticular layer is where hair follicles are also found. You also have fat cells, sweat glands, blood vessels, lymph glands, erector pili muscles, and oil glands. But in particular, for the reticular layer, we would number one, we will find hair follicles. Okay. Now, let's jump down to the bottom of page 222 and talk about subcutaneous tissue. This is also known as adipose tissue. Now, what adipose tissue or subcutaneous tissue does is give smoothness and contour to the body, and it contains fats for use as energy and also acts as a protective cushion to the outer skin. Okay. Now let's look at page 223. If we're talking about the skin and its health, or how it has the smoothness and contour given by the subcutaneous tissue or adipose tissue, let's talk about how the skin is nourished. Okay. Top of the page of 223, I'm coming from the text. It states, as the blood and lymph circulate through the skin, they contribute essential materials for growth, nourishment, and repair of the skin, hair, and nails. Let's remember, appendages of the skin are the hair and nails. Okay. The other part of this is that the networks of arteries and lymphatics in the subcutaneous tissue send their smaller branches to hair, papillae, hair follicles, and skin glands. Now, when we're talking about how the skin is nourished and the networks of different arteries in the subcutaneous tissue, of course, we have to talk about the nerves. Now, the skin contains nerve endings or nerve fibers, in particular three. You have your motor nerve fibers that handles the movement, sensory nerve fibers that controls our senses, and then the secretory nerve fibers that has to do with the excretion and secretion of our oil and sweat glands. Now let's look at the motor nerve fibers in particular. Now these are distributed to the erector pili muscles, and these are attached to the hair follicles. Okay, these are one of the main things that can actually trigger goosebumps when a person is frightened or cold, as stated in the text on 223. Now, as far as sensory nerve fibers, these are responsible to send messages to the brain. And as far as the secretory nerve fibers, they are distributed to the sweat and oil glands of the skin. Now, we should know what the sweat glands are, and we should know what the oil glands are as far as the technical term. We'll get to that in a second as well. Now, let's get back into the sense of touch in reference to the papillary layer. As far as the papillary layer is concerned, it houses the actual nerve endings that provide the body with the sense of touch. So as far as our sensory nerve fibers, they can be found in the papillary layer. Now that also should be highlighted, and you can also see a figure on figure 10.3 where the sensory nerve endings are in the skin, which are held in the papillary layer. Let's turn our pages to 224, and we're going to talk about skin elasticity. There are two things in particular that have to do with the elasticity of skin. One would be collagen, and the other is elastin. Now, the collagen is what is responsible for the strength of the skin. Okay. Now, when we're talking about elastin, this gives the skin its elasticity and flexibility. And of course, the ability to regain its shape after stretching. Think of a rubber band where it stretches and returns. Elastin is responsible for that, and we all have it in our skins. Now, as we grow older, of course, the elastin somewhat wears down, okay, which is why we have depressions in the skin and or get wrinkles. But there are some things that we can do in order to try and combat that, such as regular facials, body scrubs, and things of that nature. So we got to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves out here. Now let's talk about skin color. Okay, one thing in particular we have to talk about is melanin when it comes to skin color, because it is the primary source of skin color. Now when we're talking about melanin, okay, we have to talk about the special cells called melanocytes. Okay, and this produces the pigment granules, okay, that are scattered in the germinativum and the papillary layers. Okay, I'm coming from the second paragraph here. This is what should already be highlighted on page 224. All right, and these granules are called melanosomes, and they produce the protein called melanin. Okay, and the main objective for melanin is to not only provide the source of color, but it also serves as a skin protective screen from sun rays. Okay. Now, as we go on to page 225, we're going to get off into the glands of the skin. One in particular, sweat glands, the technical name for that would be the sudoriferous gland. Okay. Now, this consists of a coil base called a fundus, F-U-N-D-U-S. I'm coming from the top of the page 225. This should be highlighted. What it is a tube-like duct that terminates at the skin surface to form the sweat pore, okay, aka sweat gland. is responsible for this. Okay, and they are numerous on the palms, soles, and foreheads, as well as armpits. Okay, we should know this and have that highlighted to a degree. Jump down to the second paragraph. What is the sweat or sudoriferous gland controlled by? Glad you asked. It is actually controlled by the nervous system. Okay. Now, what that has to do with is the regulation of body temperature and all of that good stuff. Okay, so it can actually eliminate the waste from the body. You can find this information in the second paragraph at the top of page 225. But in particular, we need to know that the excretion of sweat is under the control of the nervous system. Now let's jump down to the oil glands, and that is called the sebaceous gland. Now, what the sebaceous gland does is secrete sebum, okay, which lubricates the skin and preserves the softness of the hair. Okay. Now, of course, these little sacs are open into the hair follicle. Okay, and this is where the action happens. All right. But one thing in particular, we need to make certain that we highlight in the first paragraph of the sebaceous glands is that they secrete sebum and they lubricate the skin and preserve the softness of the hair. Jump down to the second paragraph under sebaceous glands. However, when the sebum becomes hardened and the duct becomes blocked, a blackhead is formed. Okay. Now, we can also look at this two ways, because is not sebum a factor with whiteheads as well? Yes, they are. But we'll learn on the difference between the whitehead and the blackhead later in this chapter in a second. Let's talk about the absorption level of skin on page 225. What this does is the skin serves as a protective barrier. We talked about that in the beginning of this chapter. Okay, but let's talk about the actual functions of the skin, and how would you say, in conjunction with it serving as a protective barrier. The principal function of the skin are sensation, heat regulation, absorption, protection. Circle that. You will see that I have it circled on page 225. Excretion and secretion. Now, of course, excretion, we have to break that down with the sudoriferous gland, which is the sweat gland. And then secretion would go one and the same with the sebaceous gland or the oil gland. Let's turn to page 226 and let's talk about the different disorders of the skin. Hypertrophies. We'll find this at the bottom of page 226, first paragraph under disorders of the skin. Hypertrophies such as moles and warts on the face or scalp and skin conditions that may be aggravated by facial or shaving procedures. This is one of the things that we have to be able to recognize as barbers. And this is in the middle paragraph here on page 226. Now, the other part we have to talk about are symptoms. We know about subjective symptoms and objective symptoms. We know that the subjective symptoms deals directly with the individual. And what I'm talking about with that is symptoms such as itching, burning, or pain that is felt by the individual. We can't necessarily feel that if someone is experiencing that. However, if their skin is inflamed and whatnot, of course, those would be considered objective symptoms. Okay, subjective inward, objective outward. Let's remember that. Turn to page 227. We have to make a special note here in the towards the bottom of the first paragraph where it states medicinal preparations must be applied as directed by the physician, and treatment should not extend beyond the number of applications or date indicated. Okay, so sometimes if we would have to apply some sort of topical ointment to the scalp or the skin, we definitely would have to adhere to the directions by the physician as labeled on the medication. Okay, if and when you can, try and avoid even applying any type of medicines to your clients, because you don't want to risk your license at the end of the day. Okay. Now, let's jump down to the table 10.1, the general terms relating to disease, at the bottom of page 227. The ones that we're going to focus on are allergy, congenital disease, contraindication, occupational disease, parasitic disease, seasonal disease, and subjective symptoms on page 228. And we're going to start on page 227. Now, I want you to highlight what an allergy is and the definition of it. It is the reaction due to extreme sensitivity to certain foods, chemicals, or other normally harmless substances. Okay. Usually that would result in individuals having acne rosacea, which we'll talk about later, and usually can be treated with either Benadryl, cortisone 10, or hydrocortisone, things of that nature. Congenital disease is a disease that exists at birth, such as individuals being infected with the HIV virus or other diseases that we may think of. Contraindication is any condition or disease that makes an indicated treatment or medication inadvisable. Okay, so what that means is that it is a condition or disease, okay, that makes a treatment or medication inadvisable by the barber. Okay, one thing's for certain, we don't have anything to do with topical ointments or prescribing things for an individual who may be infected with something that technically cannot be taken care of by us. For example, folliculitis barbae. The main thing that we could do for individuals suffering for folliculitis barbae is give them treatments with tin skin or kitty kitty or bump stopper and things like that. Let's turn to page 228. Occupational disease. This is an illness resulting from conditions associated with employment, such as coming into contact with certain chemicals or tints. Okay, so we're talking about begins or any type of hair lightener or things like that. Okay, by us actually acquiring a disease from such in the workplace, this is what the cause is, and this is where it comes from. Parasitic disease. We should know what this is because this is all having to do with tinea psychosis, tinea vulgaris, because these are diseases caused by vegetable or animal parasites. Now, they also talk about pediculosis and ringworm. Now, we should know what pediculosis is, that is caused by either lice or scabies, head louse or scabies, in particular scabies. Now, let's jump down to the seasonal disease. This is disease influenced by the weather, aka the flu, H1N1, all that other good stuff. Subjective symptoms, once again, are symptoms that can be felt, such as itching, burning, or pain. Jump to 229. Let's talk about the lesions of the skin. A lesion is a structural change in the tissues caused by injury or disease. Now, what we have to remember is that there are three types of lesions: primary, secondary, or tertiary. What we are only going to be concerned with are the primary and secondary lesions only. Okay. Now let's jump over to page 230. In particular, we're going to look at a tumor. Okay. And what a tumor is an abnormal cell mass varying in size, shape, and color, and it results from the excessive multiplication of cells. Now, nodules are also referred to as tumors, as they state in the text, but they are smaller. So what we have to think of are on the lines of, let's say, fibroids. All right. Now, when we talk about vesicles, vesicles are small blisters or sacs containing clear fluid. Okay. Now, these would lie just beneath the epidermis, and usually an individual will contract vessels by coming into contact with poison ivy or poison oak. Okay. Now, let's jump down to the secondary lesions. We have the excoriation, which is a skin sore produced by scratching or scraping. Circle scraping there, as you see that I have on page 230. Now, look over to page 231. We're going to talk about a fissure, which is a crack in the skin that penetrates into the dermis, okay, such as chapped hands or lips. In particular, we're going to talk about lips. Connect that with a fissure, okay, a crack in the lips. A crack in the lips that has penetrated into the dermis is called a fissure, Fissure. That's at the top of page 231. A keloid is a thick scar resulting from excessive growth of fibrous tissue. Let's look at that. We see the figure 1010 where an individual would have keloids. Now, don't forget, an individual can be born with those as well. All right. Jump down to an ulcer. That's the final bullet point under secondary lesions. Now, this is an open lesion on the skin or mucous membrane of the body, accompanied by pus and loss of skin depth, a deep erosion or depression in the skin, and this is normally due to infection or cancer. So, an ulcer isn't necessarily the same as a boil. Okay, a boil can actually be considered a bulla. Okay, and you can find what a bulla is on page 229, but we don't need to know that for the exam. Let's talk about the hypertrophies of the skin. Hypertrophy of the skin is an abnormal growth of skin tissue that is usually harmless. Okay. In particular, we're going to focus on what a mole is. A mole is a small brownish spot or blemish on the skin, ranging in color from pale tan to brown to bluish black. Now, these actually can protrude from the skin. Okay, and some can be small and flat, and they would be like freckles. Okay, they can actually have hair growing out of them and things of that nature. Okay, they do have to have medical attention if they are looking to be removed, the ones that protrude from the skin, of course. Now, let's talk about the different pigmentations of skin. Okay, in particular, we're going to talk about lentiginous. Now, this is a technical term for freckles. All right, and they are considered small yellow to brown colored spots appearing on the skin when exposed to sunlight and air. Now, nevus. What is nevus? It's a small, I'm looking at 232. It is a small or large malformation of the skin due to abnormal pigmentation. All right. Now, this is commonly known as a birthmark. Okay. Now, individuals that you will see that with typically don't have any type of papules or pustules surrounding any of that. It's just discoloration, almost similar to a port wine stain, but usually a port wine stain has everything to do with an individual having certain diseases and it has passed. Now let's talk about the different inflammations of the skin. In particular, we're going to focus on herpes simplex on page 233. Now this is a recurring viral infection that produces fever blizzards or cold sores, and you usually would find those in the mouth area if you will see figure 1015. Okay. Now wait, before we actually get off in the rest of that, let's talk about the other inflammation of skin that we need to know, which is anthrax. It's a inflammatory bacterial disease characterized by the presence of a small red-brown pupil, followed by the formation of a pustule, vesicle, and hard swelling. Now let's talk about the difference between a pupil and a pustule. Okay, what you would consider a bump is on the face would just simply be a pupil. All right, what we would call a pimple. Now, what winds up happening when pus is formed in that bump, it has now become a pustule. All right. So that's the understanding of that. Now that we're talking about pimples and such, let's talk about the disorders of the sebaceous glands on 233. Acne. Now, acne is a skin disorder characterized by chronic inflammation of the sebaceous gland from retained secretions. So what they're talking about, retained secretions, is that yes, the sebaceous gland did secrete, but did it do so successfully? No, it did not. All right. Now let's look down at the bottom of that paragraph of acne and talk about the factors that can trigger it. The factors could be heredity, hormones, stress, and digestive disturbances. And you want to circle trigger inflammations for those. Okay. We're going to focus on grade 2. There are 4 grades of acne, but we're going to focus on grade 2 because they hold many closed comedones and more open comedones. Okay, and more papules and pustules. Let's turn the page to 234. In reference to comedones, all right, look in the middle of the paragraph as far as the bullet point of comedones is concerned. When it states, comedones appear most frequently on the face, forehead, and nose, sometimes on the chest, back, or shoulders. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between the open comedones and the closed comedones. Now, the open comedones are considered blackheads, and they occur when excess oil in the follicles are exposed to oxygen and oxidizes to a dark color. Now, closed comedones, whiteheads, which can also be mistaken for pustules or considered pustules possibly, do not have a follicular opening to be exposed to oxygen, so the sebum remains to a whitish color and produces only a white head. Okay, hopefully we have a fair understanding of that. Now let's jump down to rosacea, formerly known as acne rosacea. Now, this is characterized by redness, dilation of the blood vessels, and the formation of papules and pustules. You can see some figures on page 235 in figure 1020 in reference to that. All right. Now let's talk about steatoma. This is in figure 1022. What this is, it's a sebaceous cyst. Okay. So if they're saying sebaceous, we know that has to do with oil. Sebaceous cyst or fatty tumor that is filled with sebum. Okay, and we know that sebum is also having to do with oil. It does range in size from a pea to an orange, and where it usually occurs is on the scalp, neck, or back, and is sometimes called a wen, W-E-N. All right, now jump down to the disorders of the sudoriferous glands, aka the sweat glands. Now we do have one thing in particular, such as bromidrosis. Now some of us fellas may be more familiar with that, especially when we got our boots or our gym shoes on or whatnot. And this refers to the foul-smelling perspiration, usually noticed in the armpits or on the feet. All right. Now hyperhidrosis is excessive perspiration caused by excessive heat or general body weakness. Now, also, this will produce a foul-smelling odor as well. But in particular, we want to focus on miliary rubra. Now, what this is, it has to do with heat rash and things of that nature. It is an inflammatory disorder of the sweat glands, but it's usually caused by exposure to excessive heat. All right, this can also be considered prickly heat as well. Now jump down real quick. We're going to talk about basal cell carcinoma. This is a form of skin cancer. What we need to know is that skin cancer is usually due to overexposure from the sun. All right, this skin cancer comes in three distinct forms. You have the basal cell carcinoma, which is the most common, squamous carcinoma, okay, which is the second stage of basal cell carcinoma, and then you have malignant melanoma. But what we're going to focus on is the basal cell carcinoma. As I stated, it's the most common and least severe type of skin cancer, and this is on page 235. However, if that goes untreated, what we see on page 236 is a squamous cell carcinoma. Now, this is not where we would like to be. It's a skin cancer that is more serious than basal cell carcinoma, and it is often characterized by scaly red papules or nodules. Okay, now remember, nodules are almost one and the same with tumors, however, they are smaller. We see what the squamous cell carcinoma is on figure 1024. Now, in knowing all of this in reference to what we have learned in reference to the skin, we have to know how to maintain the health of the skin. So let's jump down to that particular topic. Number one, foods. We have to eat a well-balanced diet of three basic food groups. Okay, those food groups consist of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And in the text, they state this is the best way to support the health of the skin. And of course, in having maintaining a healthy diet, we have to have our proper amount of vitamins and supplements as well. In particular, for the exam, we're going to focus on vitamin C. It is important to the skin and tissue repair. And then we're going to also look at vitamin E, and that helps to fight against harmful effects against the sun rays. So if an individual actually can have an onset case of basal cell carcinoma, I'm almost certain that a physician would possibly recommend that the individual take vitamin E supplements just to try and fight that situation off. Now, that's the wrap up on what we have for chapter 10 in the skin. And you should be able to answer all of these review questions, and not only answer those, but in conjunction with your vocabulary open book quiz and your study guide, you are well ready for your exam.